Now, in the wake of the coups spreading on the African continent, many would say, now coup they reign. Some leaders are taking proactive steps by reshuffling defense portfolios. On Wednesday, it was reported that Cameroon's President Paul Biya, who's been in office for about 40 years, made major changes to the country's Ministry of Defense. Among the posts reshuffled were the delegates to the presidency in charge of Defense, Air Force, Staff, Navy, and the police.
Biya is said to have come to power in a coup d'etat in 1982, his early years characterized by reports of oppression and human rights violations. Shortly after the Gabon coup, Rwanda's Defense Force, RDF, also announced on X, the social media platform formerly known as Twitter, that President Paul Kagame approved the retirement of 83 senior officers.
Now, according to the RDF, Kagame also approved the promotion and appointment of some officers to replace the previous office holders. In 2015, Rwanda's constitution was changed to allow Kagame to remain president until 2034. The 65-year-old has been in power since the year 2000 and is one of Africa's longest-serving presidents. These reshufflements are therefore coming only a few hours after the Gabon coup. We're joined this morning by global affairs analyst Collins Wike to help make sense of all of this going on. Good morning, Mr. Wike. Thanks for joining us.
Good morning, Osal. Thank you for having me.
All right. So now we've seen, of course, these reported reshuffling of the defense and, of course, military formations in some of these countries. You know, people, of course, have said it's in reaction to the coups that have become very popular across the continent, and maybe also because of guilty conscience, you know, on these presidents who have been there for more than 30 years. But I want to see if you agree that that's, you know, the cause of these reshuffling, and will this, you know, stop what might still happen?
I agree totally with the assertions you've made, but in addition to that, the reshuffle of the military apparatuses in Africa and more, I must say, are set to be seen in the coming weeks, in the coming months. It's also a panic reaction. Panic reaction in the sense that, you know, when you hear ECOWAS, when you hear AU, actually shouting out and reacting in the manner that they have done, some of their actions actually not well thought through, it is also part of that panic reaction, because something tells them, well, if it is going to happen in you know, in Rwanda, sorry, if it's going to happen in Niger, if it's happening in, you know, any other part of Africa, it could be my country as well. And so let us use the opportunity, because we have it, to send a strong message out there. But you see, this is not going to, you know, solve the problem long term. Yes, short term, yes, you know, it might be indeed that, you know, actions are delayed. And when I say action, I mean military coup, that they are delayed. But ultimately, what will solve this problem in a sustainable manner is, number one, the whole idea of tenure elongation, you know, has got to stop. I mean, at this stage of Africa's development, I think everything speaks to the advantages of ensuring that nobody stays in power for too long. Now, I know that it's an accepted or acceptable, you know, democratic, you know, practice that some nations can have, you know, no term limits. But I believe that, I mean, from the examples we have seen, in those countries where there is, you know, limited terms of office, you can hardly find coups happening, at least in the last 2 decades. And then those who make those, you know, changes in terms of tenure elongation, actually benefiting from those, you know, changes is, simply put, a crime. We have seen that in, you know, Cameroon. We've seen that in Rwanda, and so on and so forth. So it's not going to change anything, the reshuffle. What is going to change the situation is a change in the democratic architecture and a sweeping mindset on the part of the leaders.
So what will change this democratic architecture that you've spoken about? We parade ourselves to be able to, or to be running a democracy on the continent. But what we've seen is that the democracy is, subject to certain terms and conditions. You've talked about tenure elongation. There are a number of African leaders who have held on to power for the longest years, or longest amount of years. Paul Kagame, approximately, say, 23 years. We have Yoweri Museveni, who's about 38 years, and rumored to be maybe handing over power to his son, Colonel Kainerugaba. Rugaba, thank you very much. I mean, yes, there's a project Muhoozi. I mean, there's so many leaders. If we start to count, what will make us get to the point where tenure elongation will not be a conversation on the table, where African leaders no longer see the need to hold on to power, and when they're done with their tenure, they move on to the next one, or they allow somebody else take over?
Well, I believe that it is a good thing to leave people with discretion. So what that means is that in respect of individual sovereignty of all of these countries, that they let the government in place in consultations with their people to determine what is best for them. There is absolutely no doubt about that. And I believe that in the instituting act of the regional bodies and other blocks, ECOWAS, SADC, and AU, that they made provision for all of this. But you see, if they see that the situation is no longer tenable as it is right now in Africa, I believe that a more structured change in the legislations, in the instituting acts of these regional blocks might be a good place to start, where they actually make it an offense against their act for member countries to institute, tenure elongation, as well as benefiting from that tenure elongation. So any country who does that actually knows that you are breaking the law of either the ECOWAS or the AU, and that you are out of the law. That is acting in a proactive, preemptive manner, rather than waiting for these problems to occur, and then you begin to, find a way around it. Also, one of the things that President Obasanjo of Nigeria did at the time was what he called the peer review mechanism. It might be a scratch on the surface, but I believe also that it might have, some positive impact in terms of ensuring that African countries, begin to implement that peer review. It should no longer be a voluntary thing. They have to make it an obligatory thing for, that peer review to take place. Now, these are just two examples of what could be done to at least begin to see a drop in this menace of, forceful seizure of power through the barrel of the gun.
All right, Mr. Wike, if we all say no to military coup and, of course, military takeover of governments across Africa, everybody says, oh, that we should never stand for that and all of that. What other options do the people have when a government has gone on for 40 years and it is not benefiting the people? What other options do they have? And, of course, bear in mind that the institutions of democratic governments across the country, across the continent, have all been broken down to pieces. They almost, are useless in helping the people to make these decisions. So how else can the people get themselves out of a situation like that without involving the military?
Yes, very good question. And, any one of us out here that would claim not to be bothered about the alternative to coup is actually, not being, truthful. Now, let me make a bit of an analogy with Nigeria. Now, people would say that in the times when, military regime held sway in Nigeria, that the effective and virulent, activities of pro-democracy movement, didn't quite do much. No, that is not true. The fact of the matter is that the military regimes at the time in Nigeria actually yielded in a very, very major way to the agitations coming from the civil society organizations. I believe that, yes, the will of democracy, good governance, and all of that, they grind very, very slowly. But ultimately, they are confirmed to be the best way out of this quagmire. So, to summarize my point, I believe that a more active and consistent and persistent civil society activities is one of the major ways of ensuring that you keep the soldiers in the barracks where they belong, and then ensure that the rule of law, constitutional democracy, is one that continues to thrive. And indeed, in combination with all other means and measures that I have enumerated earlier. But the point here is the people themselves, organized through the civil society organizations, remain the most potent tool to fight the menace that Africa is currently facing.
All right, let's talk about the role that the international bodies have. Based off the recent coup in Gabon, the African Union has suspended Gabon. And we've seen that in more recent times, we've been seeing them more active, speaking up, imposing sanctions. What role do ECOWAS, the African Union as well, what role do these bodies have to play in ensuring that we uphold democracy, not only when there's a coup or an attempted coup, but also upholding democracy when there's a coup at the ballots, a coup of the ballot, where we see leaders who are trying to usurp authority that they already have or using influence to take away the will of the people?
Well, the ECOWAS, the AU, appear to be accomplices in these crimes because, like I alluded to earlier on, they are very good at looking away when their friends are the ones, behaving badly. Like I often say, those bodies have become, a club of tired old men whose job is there simply to protect their own personal interests, but those of their friends and their allies. Now, can you imagine, for instance, in Nigeria, and nothing has gone wrong. I mean, the appointment of President Bola Tinubu was according to the rotational arrangement of ECOWAS, but nothing should stop ECOWAS, for instance, in ensuring that any African leader whose turn it is to be the chairman of ECOWAS, but the person's election is in contention, that person should be kept out of the door until the issue is sorted out. Now, what business has Paul Kagame of Rwanda leading the long-term strategy of African Union, the futuristic plan as they call it, when the man has illegitimately elongated his term of office to the point that by the time he's leaving office, he may have served for some 40, 45 years. Yes, people say he's doing wonderful things in Rwanda. He's a purposeful leader and all of that. Maybe that is true, but if you don't give a chance to other people and groom successors, well, then you are a good leader by half. So you see, the whole apparatus, including the especially the ECOWAS African Union, have got to be rigid, thoroughly reformed if we want to see them play the sort of purposeful role that they ought to be playing to prevent, not actually sort out, not beginning to solve the problems, but to prevent those problems from happening in the first place.
Mr. Wike, must all African countries practice, democracy? Is it a must that everyone has to, cover themselves with this cloak of democracy, even if, in practice and in reality, it's really just civilian rule? And, they continue to subvert the will of the people. They continue to carry out coups on themselves through democratic means. And so, is there any other form of government that maybe African countries should start looking towards, of course, to move forward? And also the dishonesty with the whole, there's been factors that, of course, have aided these persons to stay in office for so long. Yes, the international community, yes, ECOWAS and the likes, but I know that you also mentioned civil society groups. But to a large extent, those things don't work. We've seen, when, opposition parties are brutalized and arrested and locked up and all of that on the continent. Those things don't work.
Well, whatever name people choose to call it, that is actually their decision and their choice. What Africa needs, just like most other parts of the thriving world, is a practice where the people are at the center of making the choice of their leaders. Okay, and if you go to the textbooks and try to find out what democracy is all about, that is actually the short definition of it. So whichever other name they want to give it, it's up to them. Now, leadership or a governance structure where a few privileged men, because oftentimes, it is men, the women are relegated to the background somewhere, where a few men stay together in one, room with a cognac in their hands, deciding who leads and who doesn't lead, is not something for Africa. I know that some people have canvassed a situation where, they have leadership by appointment by a select number of people. Look at what is supposed to be happening at the courts of law. The courts of law all over Africa have become an appendage of the government in place. So you see, a practice of the people electing or choosing who their leader is going to be remains the best way out. And I think the conversation should actually focus on how to sharpen that tool so that it delivers more dividend to the people, rather than canvassing any other means that actually transfers that authority of leadership, being in the hands of just a few. Yes, democracy has its, downsides. It is a wheel that grinds very, very slowly, but ultimately it has been,
here's the thing.
To be the best option.
Here's the thing. I mean, I understand, how we need, a system of government where, that gives the people the power. But does the continent need to get to a breaking point, where we can then say, because the stage that it currently is, every single institution of government across majority of the countries, on the continent, those institutions have been broken down to their bare minimum. They cannot stand against or challenge those persons in office who continue to subvert the will of the people and carry out coups and change the constitution to give themselves more time in office. These institutions have failed. Civil society has failed. The ECOWAS and the AU and the likes have failed. So does the continent need to get to a break point where everybody then needs to have like a fresh start, and then they can then strengthen these institutions that would ensure that the will of the people is protected? Because as it stands, it's not going to happen. If we're being realistic, it's not going to happen. There's no institution, even here in Nigeria, that would challenge the executive.
The breaking point is now, because what Africa is witnessing now is something that they've never seen before. Now, you are never going to get to a situation where everything lies flat, and then total anarchy, everything, is broken down before action begins to happen. And we started this conversation with the panic reaction of, two, long-term 7 African leaders Yes, that is a panic reaction. And it is a reaction to the near revolution that is now taking place. What we have heard about is how many people, the reshufflement that took place. Excuse me. We haven't known, and we probably wouldn't know, how many people have been perished as a consequence of this panic that has gripped them. So you see, the revolution is gradually beginning to happen, and if we see the reaction of everybody, that confirms it. And so all that has to happen is step it up. This is not time for less action, but time for more action, and that action actually includes getting the military people to stay in the barracks and defend their national borders. That is what they are set up for, not to meddle into government. So it remains an aberration. And, the civil society organizations, like I said earlier, remains the most potent tool to sustain the fight and, keep it burning.
All right. As we have seen in many other coups, several international communities react differently. More recently, we saw how very enraged France seemed by the coup in Niger, even though they say they're no longer interested in making, in holding to their grip on these countries that were formerly, or these countries that were colonized by the French. What does this coup, and what do these repeated coups that are happening, what do they say about the continent? How do they present us on the foreign scene? And do we expect that, the international, different countries, the West maybe, I would say the West, would maybe take advantage of this and then exploit the continent? Is that something to be afraid of?
Two things to be said about that. Number one, the Western powers, those that we call the imperialists, who are in Africa for one reason or the other, are there for their interest. And their relationship with Africa is built around their national interest. Don't get me wrong, there is nothing wrong in pursuing your interests. But you see, when those interests are narrowly defined to mean me, and me, then in the long run, you are facing a huge problem. If you have a broadly defined national interest, which, for instance, states that peace in Africa, job creation in Africa, supported by the resources of the West, is part of the national interest of the Western economies, because it keeps people in their country, and the flow of migration is not something that will bother us. That is a broad interpretation of national interest. So as long as they continue to interpret national interest to mean just me and myself, I mean, these problems will persist. That's number one. And then number two, if Africa doesn't realize that the continent is for them, not for anybody else to develop, then the problems will continue to fester. And so on those two fronts, I believe that some of the international bodies, the World Trade Organization, United Nations, and all of that have got to be reformed in a fairer manner. Tariffs, for instance, is something that needs to be revisited. I'll give you two examples, as a matter of fact, if I may. One, commodities coming from Africa. There has always been this issue of finding some protectionist ways to keep, trading commodities in a way that disfavors Africa. I believe that one of the ways that has to be solved is essentially compelling these countries to set up production activities in Africa, and as a matter of fact, if possible, ban importation of raw materials coming out of Africa. Let them be fully processed in Africa, or at least half processed before they are, shipped away to the destination countries. And that's one. And then the other example has to do with, for instance, the draconian independent, pre-independent, and post-independent laws France is notorious for that, that actually ties the economy of these countries to the Western economy in a manner that benefits them. Haiti has only just finished a few years back, has only just finished paying their slavery,
Right.
rules with
Mr.
France.
Wike, we might have to interject now because we've run out of time, but I mean, those 2 points that you've raised are very important, looking at the draconian laws and then looking at how we can ensure that production is done fully or at least halfway on the continent. We hope that these are conversations that we can have in the nearest future and look for how best we can make these policies to favor the continent. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. It's always a pleasure to have you.